Can you imagine the dry taste of humiliation first thing in the morning? That's exactly what I felt when I walked into the glass-enclosed office of my new office in Manhattan. The sun beating down lazily against the skyscrapers as the clock struck 8:02. Under my arm, I carried a slim leather briefcase, where I rested, almost triumphantly, the Harvard diploma that had cost me sleepless nights, bitter coffees, and countless moments when I almost gave up. I was nervous, of course. It was my first day as Deputy CEO, or so the title suggested, although no one there seemed to take any position below theirs seriously. As soon as I sat down at the conference table, the so-called supreme boss, Mr. Barlow, entered the room. He wore a crisp navy suit, a heavy ring glinting on his fat finger, and a smile that looked like the grin of a hungry wolf. He leaned forward to peer at the diploma I'd carefully placed on the table, raised his eyebrows, and in a gesture that stung more than if he'd spit in my face, simply rolled his eyes. The rest of the board chuckled. The air felt thick, almost palpable, with embarrassment and the clear message, no matter where you come from, you're nothing here. I felt my stomach tighten, my vision blur, but I forced a smile. It was then that Mr. Barlow clicked his tongue and said dismissively, "Ah, Harvard. Those rich kids think they're worth something in the real world. Well, I hope you can make coffee too, Doc." The blood rushed to my face, my heart pounded, and for a second I thought about getting up and leaving. But something inside me, maybe pride, maybe pure malice, stopped me. I took a deep breath, leaned back in my chair, and with a half smile, said calmly, "Actually, Mr. Barlow, I'm quite comfortable with my investment here. After all, I've owned 50% of the company since the venture capital round last fall." The silence that followed was so thick that I could almost hear the nervous ticking of the clock on the wall. His face drained of color, the other executive's eyes widened, and it was as if I'd dropped a bomb in the center of that gleaming mahogany table. The silence hung heavy for long, almost painful seconds, until Mr. Barlow coughed, tried to compose his face, and with a stiff smile muttered something like, Sure, it's great to know we have such young and dynamic investors." But the awkwardness had already spread like a deadly virus through the room. One of the directors avoided my gaze, another pretended to review notes that didn't exist, and the rest shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather-upholstered chairs. I took advantage of that moment to open my briefcase, calmly pull out a few quarterly reports that I had reviewed the night before, and place them in front of everyone. Each sheet landed on the table with a soft crack that seemed to hammer their pride. I explained, in a firm, measured voice, how I intended to reorganize certain departments, cut excess, and accelerate innovation. Basically, I planned to dismantle the comfort zones they had guarded tooth and nail for the past few years. Mr. Barlow smiled, but his eyes were cold, assessing me as if I were a direct threat to his survival, which, to be frank, I was. When the meeting was over, he invited me to an informal coffee in his office, which was upstairs. The invitation felt like both a trap and a challenge. The elevator to the executive floor seemed to ascend in slow motion, while I could almost hear my own heartbeat. As soon as I entered, I was greeted by an opulent environment, Persian carpet, antique furniture that exuded the sweet smell of varnish, and paintings of bucolic landscapes that did not match the man's cynicism at all. He offered me coffee, which I declined, and then the real game began. In a honeyed voice, he praised my young energy, talked about how much the market needed new blood, and ended by saying that he was willing to help me navigate the turbulent waters of the industry. As long as I didn't get too radical with my ideas, I felt my stomach turn. It was clear that this was a disguised warning. He wanted to keep his informal power intact, with me serving as a modern screen for investors and the press. I just smiled and said I would consider his advice, but deep down I was already planning another path. Over the next few days, I started arriving before everyone else and leaving after them. I started talking directly to technical team leaders, developers, and product managers, the people who really made things happen but who were never invited to those imported wine dinners and cynical giggles. I drank coffee from plastic cups in the smaller departments, listened to complaints, and understood bottlenecks. Little by little, a network of loyalties began to form around me. Something Mr. Barlow never noticed because he was too busy checking bonus quotas and booking resorts for the end of the year. Meanwhile, I put together internal reports that showed how the departments protected by his allies were wasting absurd amounts of money, overcharging for contracts, and producing projects that were not generating any return. A month later, I called another board meeting, this time with an extra item on the agenda. an extraordinary review of contracts, and an independent audit to assess internal compliance. Mr. Barlow's face changed color almost instantly, from bright red to almost gray. He tried to protest, saying that this would disrupt the natural rhythm of the company, but it was too late. His vote, even combined with 2 longtime directors, did not outweigh my share. The rest of the board, motivated by fear or ambition, supported the proposal. When the audit began, the company's entrails were exposed like an open carcass. There were fake invoices, shady payments, dubious hiring by companies linked to Mr. Barlow's family. Each document that arrived on my desk was more rotten than the last. The scandal grew like a tumor, and I fed it with the cold, calculating determination of someone who knew exactly where I wanted to go. Then came the day when I had to confront Mr. Barlow directly. It was a rainy Friday, the sound of raindrops against the high windows providing a morbid soundtrack. I asked him to come to my office, and when he entered, I could already tell that something had changed in him. He was pale, his hands shaking slightly. Before he could say anything, I slid him a folder containing the final audit report. For a moment, he just stared at it, perhaps expecting to find some loophole, some technical error. But the contents were all too clear. There was incontrovertible evidence of mismanagement, nepotism, and the misuse of corporate resources for personal gain. One could have taken this to the authorities immediately, but there was something much crueler and, I admit, satisfying about allowing him to choose the fate of his own downfall. I calmly told him he had 2 options: submit a polished resignation letter that I had drafted myself to save time, or face an internal lawsuit that would destroy not only his reputation in the market but also his family. Since the contracts he had signed involved immediate family members. The man seemed to wither before me, his shoulders slumping, his gaze lost somewhere behind my head. Finally, he picked up the pen with stiff, almost arthritic fingers and signed the document. There was no exchange of words, just the dry sound of the pen scratching the paper and then the soft thud as he pushed the folder back. As he left, he didn't look me in the eye, but my revenge didn't end there. I knew that Mr. Barlow had rotten alliances in several subsidiaries, so I took advantage of the momentum to clean up the entire structure. In less than 3 months, a dozen directors were fired, contracts were torn up, and entire teams were restructured. The company bled for a while, and the stock fluctuated, but at the end of the fiscal cycle, our valuation soared precisely because we had eliminated parasites that were eating away at the company's future. Investors returned confident, attracted by the new, lean model and the innovations I had promised from the beginning. And me. I kept showing up early, talking to engineers, visiting production lines, reporting directly to the board, and laying the groundwork for the next round of international expansion. Sometimes, in the solitude of my office, I would glance at the Harvard diploma hanging discreetly on the wall, not out of vanity, but as a silent reminder that he had been undervalued. Just like me, time passed as if it were rushing to test me. There were months in which I slept little, ate at odd hours, and kept endless notes on every internal movement. I knew that this cleansing, however necessary it was, created resentment. Some of Mr. Barlow's former allies who had not been caught by the audit kept their positions, although more silent, almost fearful, but their eyes followed me through the corridors with the same hunger as those who wait for the slightest weakness to attack. So I decided that I needed to consolidate my position in a way that did not depend solely on fear. I promoted a series of rounds of open conversations with middle and lower management. I sat with them in simple rooms, sometimes even in the operating sectors themselves, listening to problems, writing down each complaint, showing genuine interest. This caused an unexpected stir. Suddenly, spontaneous reports began to emerge, small complaints of waste, suggestions for innovation that had previously died buried under bureaucracy. I turned these ideas into pilot projects, gave public credit to those who contributed, and before long the company's operational base began to see me as a legitimate leader, not just the arrogant shareholder who bought half the business out of thin air. Of course, that didn't mean everyone was happy. Older investors, accustomed to fat dividends even in times of stagnation, began to question my strategy of reinvesting a significant portion of profits into research and development. I received cold calls and technically laden emails trying to intimidate me, but I wasn't the scared young woman who had arrived that first day. Each meeting with these soft-spoken men and women with calculated smiles became an arena in which I presented solid numbers, consistent forecasts, and case studies that proved the growing health of our new model. Some remained reluctant, But most had no choice but to give in, seduced by the prospect of even greater profits in the medium term. While all this was happening, Mr. Barlow became a ghost in the financial media. News of his voluntary departure circulated in a controlled manner, with press releases written by our own communications department, but the market knew how to read between the lines. I saw small articles speculating on hushed-up scandals, without ever stating anything that could lead to defamation lawsuits. To me, it was perfect. I wanted suspicion to hang over him, without the satisfaction of a public trial. I wanted him to be haunted at every corporate dinner, at every event where he had to force a smile and explain why he was unemployed, why he had been withdrawn from boardroom invitations. That, to me, was crueler than any thunderous headline. On the one-year anniversary of my official arrival as an executive, I organized a conference for shareholders and strategic partners. It was held in a luxurious hotel, with chandeliers that looked like they had been taken from French castles, and waiters circulated with silver trays balancing fragile crystal glasses. I wore a sober black dress, my hair tied back in a tight bun, and my posture impeccable. During my speech, I reviewed achievements, showed upward graphs, and projected numbers that made investors' eyes light up, but I also discreetly included initiatives that would make the company less dependent on flawed contracts and corrupt internal networks. I spoke about governance, compliance, and cutting-edge technology, almost as if I were a veiled warning to anyone who thought of replicating Mr. Barlow's old model. I received calculated applause, toasts, and pats on the back, but what I was really interested in was observing who looked away, who frowned slightly, who squeezed their champagne glass too tightly. These were my future targets. A few months later, I traveled to the Houston branch to evaluate a promising clean energy project. When I got there, I was greeted by a local director who, oddly enough, insisted on treating me with a certain paternalism. She called me sweetheart, praised my youthful brilliance, and made subtle observations about how the presidency required broader shoulders, which only come with age. I wrote down each of these remarks in my mind, without arguing, allowing her to bask in her own arrogance. On the second day of the visit, I called a technical presentation with the entire engineering team and asked her to explain the project's metrics. It took just 10 minutes for it to become clear that she had not mastered even the basics of what was being done. The awkwardness spread throughout the room as I asked specific questions, citing specific terms that I had studied late the night before, just for this occasion. In the end, I simply thanked her with a neutral smile, leaving the rest of the attendees to digest the embarrassment alone. 2 weeks later, the director resigned, citing personal reasons. To the press, it was just another normal executive turnover. To those paying attention, it was a silent reminder that my approach was not based solely on audits or reports, but on almost obsessive vigilance. I was building a modern empire on the ruins of the pride of men and women, who believed that the corporate world still followed the same rules as decades past. And I had no regrets. Many nights, when I returned to my quiet apartment, I felt a pang of loneliness, almost melancholy. I watched the city skyline through the large living room window, the lights blinking like small, lonely beacons. I wondered if there was another way to get to where I was, without destroying reputations, without instilling fear. But I always came to the same answer. Power in this environment is not won with smiles or handshakes. It is wrested away, piece by piece, until there is no doubt who is in charge. I began to receive invitations to speak at universities, ironically the same ones that so many of my former enemies loved to show off on their resumes. I went to Harvard, spoke to eager MBA classes about aggressive corporate restructuring, used graphs, showed data, but did not reveal the real driving force behind it all. The almost pathological thirst to prove that it would never be diminished again. Every round of applause at the end of these lectures sounded to me like a collective plea for absolution, as if the academic world wanted to convince itself that training tough and ruthless people was a noble part of its legacy. I just smiled, posed for photos, signed books. I returned to the hotel with a silent tightness in my chest, which would go away as soon as I started planning the company's next international expansion move. It wasn't long before, during one of these trips, I received a quiet report that Mr. Barlow was trying to buy back small stakes through frontmen, perhaps in a desperate attempt to regain some influence on the board. I sent lawyers to track down every suspicious acquisition and called special meetings to approve changes to the bylaws, tightening rules against indirect ownership. To the public, this seemed like just another technical adjustment. To Barlow, it was the final nail in the coffin of any remaining dreams he might have harbored. The last time I heard from him, he was in a luxury clinic on the East Coast, supposedly resting after a nervous breakdown. No reporter seemed interested enough to investigate further. The world moves too fast to dwell on corporate corpses. From the moment the doors finally closed on Mr. Barlow, the company seemed to breathe a different air. Not because it was lighter, but because the fear had changed hands. It was no longer the owl disguised as flattery that had surrounded this old patriarch, puffed up with self-confidence. Now it was a quiet, almost reverent fear that could be detected in the averted glances as I passed through the hallways or in the exaggerated care with which I spoke during board meetings. I noticed all this without fanfare, almost like a naturalist studying the behavior of cornered predators. There were no more scornful jokes about degrees, no more weary paternalism. There was only the harsh reality that I held their future between my fingers. During this period, I began to outline the most daring project the company had ever had. A transnational merger with a European technology conglomerate that would open doors to markets we had never penetrated before. The negotiations were long and tense, held in anonymous hotels with floral carpets and conference rooms that smelled of stale coffee. On the other side of the table, lawyers and management advisors tried to entice us with unfair terms, dilute our decision-making power, and test how willing I was to compromise in order to close this historic deal. I played hardball, banged my pen on the table several times, refused tight deadlines, and made counteroffers that bordered on insults. Some of my own directors broke out in a cold sweat, fearing that I would ruin everything out of pride. But for me, it was never just about pride, it was a strategic lesson. I needed them to understand that with me there were no concessions that compromised control, no matter how polished the packaging. In the end, we closed the deal on my terms. There was no applause or lavish toasts. Just signed contracts and cold hands shaking hard enough to leave marks. Back in the country, I called a controlled press conference where I revealed the deal to the market. The stocks soared within minutes. Analysts rushed to issue reports extolling the aggressiveness of the operation. Investors flooded our inboxes with questions about the next steps. Meanwhile, internally, the new structure began to be implemented with silent brutality. Redundant positions were eliminated, processes merged, decision-making centers moved to more tax-advantaged regions, all under my watchful eye and meticulous spreadsheets that tracked every penny. During those long nights of analysis, I began to feel something different. It wasn't exactly regret, but a dark curiosity. I wondered what it would have been like if, back then, I had accepted Mr. Barlow's veiled invitation to take it easy. If I had had coffee in his office, allowed petty corruption, flattered those who needed flattering, followed the old corporate playbook of smiling and nodding while suits sipped profits. Maybe today I would be just another well-paid executive, giving generic interviews about female leadership in business magazines, without having to engineer surgical dismissals or send analysts to track down former rivals' stooges. Maybe I would sleep better, get married, maybe even have children. But each time this line of thought arose, it was crushed by a cold certainty. None of this would guarantee me respect. It would all be a show. And I would continue to be at the mercy of men who rolled their eyes at diplomas and call female directors sweetheart. As the European conglomerate began sending its teams for integration, new small battles emerged. Consultants arrived with thick accents, colorful tables, imported concepts that, to them, seemed like universal dogma. They tried to convince me to adopt aesthetic compliance policies, full of glossy but empty reports, designed only to impress regulatory agencies without actually transforming the culture. I refused each decorative proposal, demanding practical actions, transparent contracts, internal audits that were not just for show. Some were embarrassed, others tried to laugh, saying that I was too American in my direct way of dealing with people. I shrugged. To me, this was just a reflection of the same mentality that once made Mr. Barlow mock my diploma-pure arrogance disguised as cosmopolitanism. At a gala dinner held to celebrate the merger, I felt the weight of everything I had built. The room was absurdly ornate, with dark velvet curtains and enormous chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like threats ready to fall at any moment. Men and women walked around in outfits worth enough to sustain small businesses, exchanging polite phrases and laughter that didn't reach their eyes. When I was called to the stage to speak, I briefly observed the entire expectant crowd. I then spoke about numbers, projections, market synergies, but mainly about responsibility. I emphasized that we were not there to build houses of cards, but rather an efficient machine that would generate value for decades. As I spoke, I saw faces smile, others remain static, and some even stiffen slightly. I recognized future allies and future obstacles there. I stepped off the stage with the feeling that the game, far from being over, was merely entering a more dangerous phase. When the event was over, I walked alone back to my suite on the top floor of the same hotel. I left my heels by the bed, poured myself a glass of water, and walked out onto the balcony. The city glowed below like a living, breathing organism, indifferent to individual victories or defeats. I leaned against the cool metal railing and let the night wind ruffle my hair. There, in the silence broken only by distant horns, I realized that everything I had done had an irreversible cost. Not just for those who had fallen along the way, but for me. I was no longer the girl who had arrived with a proud diploma under her arm, believing that academic achievement would open doors on its own. Now I was the kind of person who sent auditors after former executives, who wrote pre-formatted resignation letters, who destroyed entire careers to protect the empire she had built. I felt no remorse, but I also felt no joy. The next day, I woke up early as usual, got ready with the same methodical precision, and prepared the agenda for the meetings that would define the new group's first global contracts. Each topic, each clause he planned to discuss, was another stone in the personal monument he had built, both prison and trophy. When I finally walked down to the lobby, I noticed eyes following me. Some with genuine admiration, others with that restrained fear that had become so familiar. The car door opened, and I got in without hesitation. The phone already pressed to my ear, starting another call that would probably either ruin or save someone's week. The following weeks became a dizzying succession of flights, meetings, and contracts. I spent most of my time between airports and boardrooms that, however luxurious they were, always ended up looking the same. Long tables, carefully positioned mineral water, open notebooks with colorful graphs that tried to transform brutal decisions into something almost artistic. I began to realize that this entire universe worked like a grotesque play, where everyone knew exactly what lines to repeat and what expressions to display. The difference was that, unlike most, I no longer had to feign satisfaction. My power did not come from smiles or empty promises, but from the simple fact that, at the end of the day, the signature that sealed the company's destiny was mine. At some point, the European group began to push for even faster results than we had projected. They wanted additional cuts, aggressive operating margin targets, and demanded weekly reports that were almost absurdly detailed. Some of my own executives began to waver, wondering whether we were sacrificing innovation and corporate morale for the sake of cold numbers. I listened patiently, gave them space to speak, but in the end I made it clear that I would rather replace the entire front line than allow the company to be seen as reluctant or slow. To me, wavering was worse than making a mistake. A mistake could be corrected. The image of indecision was too costly to reverse. It didn't take long for specialized journalists to start sniffing out scandals and trying to find cracks in our expansion model. They even published articles insinuating that there was a climate of internal fear, that turnover in some departments was alarming. I didn't deny it, nor did I confirm it. I made a point of not reacting publicly. This calculated stance fueled curiosity, but it also maintained our aura of strength. Internally, I reorganized communication, establishing direct channels between technical departments and my office, eliminating intermediaries who filtered information and often distorted reports to protect their own positions. This caused immense discomfort among middle managers, but it strengthened my bond with the core group that really made the operations happen. During a global meeting in Geneva, I was confronted in a way I had never seen before. A Belgian director, polite but aggressive, brought up data on the burnout rate in our American units, and asked whether this could compromise performance in the medium term. The room was packed, the lights too bright to highlight every micro-expression. I could have resorted to bureaucratic answers, or cited HR manuals, but I chose to be brutally honest. I said that every corporate revolution exacted its human toll and that we were going through exactly that stage. Saying this out loud, in front of shareholders and consultants, was like dropping a bomb in the center of the table. Some of them widened their eyes, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to challenge me directly. When I finished, the silence went on for longer than was acceptable, until it was interrupted by small coughs and the clatter of chairs. I knew that from then on I would be seen as even more ruthless. I didn't care. Back in the United States, I found on my desk a dossier that had been months in the making. It contained data on suppliers historically linked to Barlow's management slippery contracts, masked overbilling, shell companies linked to cousins and nephews who continued to receive small fortunes even after he left. It was as if the old man was continuing to bleed our company dry from afar. I didn't hesitate. Within a few weeks, I had terminated agreements, notified tax authorities, and filed lawsuits that paralyzed the entire network. The initial impact was heavy. We had late deliveries, logistical bottlenecks, and angry customers. I spent entire nights awake, with reports spread across the hotel bed, trying to reorganize routes, pressuring new suppliers, using every penny of my credibility to guarantee deadlines. But at the end of a quarter, the numbers showed that the bleeding had stopped. Profits didn't rise immediately, but the foundation was stronger than ever. And that, to me, was worth more than any positive headline. On one of my rare free afternoons, I accepted an invitation from a former Harvard professor to give a lecture on corporate governance. The auditorium was packed with eager students, ready to hear motivational advice or formulas for success. But I offered none of that. I spoke about the stark reality of power, about how fragile alliances and flattery are smokescreens to maintain the status quo. I told, without revealing names, how I had to destroy entire careers so that the company could survive its own vices. Some faces lit up with morbid fascination, others contorted in discomfort. There were those who wrote down each sentence as if it were a recipe. When I finished, I heard restrained, somewhat tense applause. I left there with the certainty that I had deconstructed illusions. Perhaps that was my greatest service to those young people, to spare them the delusion that diplomas and good intentions are enough. When I returned to headquarters, I found a different atmosphere. The culture of efficiency and austerity that I had established was beginning to bear clear fruit. Projects that had previously been bogged down by endless chains of approvals were now flowing almost organically. Costs had fallen dramatically in areas that had previously been the private fiefdoms of decadent directors. At the same time, I noticed that many people were silent or changing course whenever I unexpectedly appeared. It wasn't the romantic idealism of charismatic leaders who inspire love. It was respect, mixed with fear, something that I had learned to not only accept but to cultivate. Because, at the end of the day, nothing preserves the destiny of a corporation and its controllers as much as the certainty that no one would dare sabotage its plans. Some nights, though, I would wake up suddenly, breathing hard, as if my own body were protesting the burden I had placed upon it. At those times, I would sit on the edge of my bed, staring into the darkness, remembering the day I had first walked into that room, diploma under my arm, so proud, so naive. I would think of Mr. Barlow rolling his eyes, of the other executives' crooked smiles, of the small humiliations that had become sparks for the silent war I fought for years to come. I wondered if I had been treated with even a modicum of respect, I would have accepted a gentler path. Maybe I would, but I was not given that chance. And now it was too late to back down. The months passed like blades passing too quickly for all the cuts to be recorded. The conglomerate we had built had become such a large organism that, at times, it seemed to have a life of its own. I could no longer follow every detail as I had in the beginning, and this, far from reassuring me, ignited a constant anxiety. To mitigate the risk, I created autonomous audit centers that answered exclusively to me. This further undermined the old culture of internal fiefdoms, but it also sowed the seeds of an almost paranoid environment of vigilance. Some executives whispered about the tense atmosphere, about the fear of making a mistake and becoming a target. I pretended not to hear. I knew that excessive fear could corrode creativity and proactivity, but I also understood that a little institutional terror was the price one paid to eradicate old practices. I preferred to deal with rebuilding motivation later than to allow the cancer of corruption to grow again. It was in this environment that worrying signs emerged that Barlow's old circle was not entirely dead. An anonymous report reached me detailing an attempted cartel among European suppliers, linked by murky links to funds controlled by frontmen. The aim was to inflate prices in new contracts for embedded technology. There was no direct evidence, but the coincidences in the bids presented in internal tenders were glaring. I immediately suspended negotiations, convened a task force to track every transaction, and ordered a precautionary freeze on payments. This move caused a small panic, including among partners who had nothing to do with the scheme, but my position was unyielding. Better a violent short circuit than a devastating fire later. The reaction was swift. I received cordial invitations to meetings in Brussels and Zurich, where they tried to persuade me to reconsider my too tough stance. A subtle lobbying effort, masked by long dinners, expensive wines, and empty praise for my precocious talent. I did not give in. Every glass I refused, every plate I pushed away almost untouched, made their embarrassment more evident. When I realized that there would be no diplomatic consensus, I announced that we would open global competitions, inviting suppliers from outside Europe to compete for the contracts. In less than 3 weeks, new proposals arrived, cheaper and technically superior. I personally signed the agreements, sealing the fate of Barlow's former cronies. I did not need to take legal action against them. The mere fact of being ignored reduced them to financial ruin, and I heard that some sold historic properties to cover losses. It was the natural order of the game that I had learned to play so well. Meanwhile, back home, the corporate culture I had established began to mutate unexpectedly. Middle managers, once fearful, now displayed an almost unhealthy loyalty. They acted as extensions of my will, anticipating orders, vying for favors, competing to prove who was most aligned with my vision. This might seem advantageous at first glance, but it made me uncomfortable. I didn't want blind subjects who couldn't challenge bad strategies just to maintain their positions. But it was hard to balance fear and respect after years of shaping every inch of that empire with a firm hand. Perhaps I had planted too many seeds of obedience and not enough courage to challenge. But it was too late to turn back. The edifice was built on these foundations, and dismantling them would expose the company to cracks that competitors would be happy to exploit. It was during this consolidation phase that I began to receive invitations to join the boards of other large multinationals. Investment banks, industrial groups, and private equity funds wanted to associate their names with mine, as a seal of relentlessness and competence. I turned down almost all of them, not out of false modesty, but because I understood that by spreading my attention, I would dilute the focus on the only construction that really mattered, our company. Even so, I accepted a few strategic seats, only where I could extract market intelligence or strengthen useful international networks. Whenever I appeared on these boards, the ritual repeated itself. Executives would come and introduce themselves, with tense smiles, rehearsed expressions of enthusiasm. I would listen to them in prolonged silence, allowing the discomfort to be part of the process. Only then would I comment on what I needed to say, briefly, directly, and surgically. At the end of the meetings, they would invariably come over to comment on how I was different from the other leaders. They had no idea how right they were. At the same time, the first serious rumors emerged that I might be on shortlists of the world's most influential CEOs. Magazines that had previously treated me as a curiosity, the young American investor who had bought half of a conglomerate, now wrote cover stories portraying me as an example of corporate discipline. I gave few interviews, all of them cold, objective, almost uncomfortable for reporters looking for punchlines. I never opened up about the origins of this hunger. I never talked about the exact day I realized the real value of power. Back in that stuffy room where a fat man rolled his eyes at my diploma, I knew that admitting my deep motivation, a revenge so old that it was no longer justified by what it was, but only by what it had become, could ruin the clean narrative that the market loved. For them, I needed to continue being the analytical prodigy, the cold strategist who saves companies from themselves. And so I did. As the years went by, more expansion cycles and consolidations followed. We signed joint ventures in Asia, bought stakes in Israeli data security startups, and established our own labs in Singapore. Each move reinforced the wall around our empire, making it harder for competitors to make a hostile move. At the same time, I kept a constant watch on internal figures who could, in the long run, reproduce old habits. I promoted people who had no patience for flattery, who showed genuine discomfort with inefficiencies, and who preferred hard reports to inflated presentations. Still, I felt that the risk never completely disappeared. Companies are living creatures, and they are prone to infection. All I did was build a more vicious but also more effective immune system, ready to quickly devour any cancer cells. One morning, after getting off a flight that had arrived early in Dallas, I walked alone through the nearly deserted lobby, holding only a briefcase and my cell phone. There was something symbolic about that silence. No red carpet, no entourage, no advisors talking about the day's agenda. Just me, the echo of my own footsteps, and the certainty that all the greatness I had built depended solely on my ability to keep holding the reins. For a moment, I wondered if that was a victory or a curse. I had no close friends, no close family ties. My connections were essentially professional, and even those who invited me to social events did so out of interest. The woman who had walked in there with a Harvard degree dreaming of recognition had transformed into something that perhaps not even she herself could name. In the days that followed, I immersed myself in sustainability reports, demanding more rigorous environmental plans. Not out of pure ecological conviction, but because I anticipated that future legislation would tighten the siege and I wanted to protect our company before it was pressured by NGOs or governments. Each department that presented weak goals received an ultimatum. No one seemed to be surprised. It had become natural for any weakness to be immediately corrected or discarded. When I finally consolidated the new environmental governance plan, some old shareholders complained about the additional cost. I explained bluntly that I would rather lose dividends now than deal with billion-dollar fines and reputational scandals in 5 years. At the end of the meeting, many left without looking at me, irritated, but they knew they had no alternative. The empire was mine. The future, even uncertain, was in my hands. One afternoon, back in New York, I sat alone in the building's largest conference room, looking out through the glass at the city below. The avenues throbbed with cars rushing by, pedestrians carrying their own tragedies and ambitions, completely unaware of the existence of a woman sitting in a leather chair, who controlled operations that moved enough money to change the fate of thousands of families. The weight of it didn't crush me. On the contrary, it gave me a cold sense of purpose. It was as if I had finally found my definitive place in the world, not as someone to be validated by others, but as the silent force that defines what remains and what disappears. From that point on, everything seemed to operate on a kind of cruelly efficient autopilot. The company, which had previously been a patchwork of personal interests and petty vanities, had become a rigid, almost mechanical organism, where each cell existed only insofar as it contributed to the movement of the whole. I had become the invisible central cog that ensured that nothing went wrong. Meetings became predictable. Reports were always on time. Audits rarely found anything more than minor flaws that were quickly corrected. The company was hitting targets, exceeding quarterly forecasts, distributing stable dividends, and shareholders who had once grumbled at my plans now smiled at annual dinners, proud to be part of the inner circle of a feared and respected organization. But beneath this smooth surface, I knew that the human cost was mounting. There were isolated cases of nervous breakdowns, small headlines in local newspapers about employees who had lost their minds and destroyed their desks, or disappeared for weeks without explanation. These did not lead to direct lawsuits against the company, because our legal shield was solid, and the quiet settlements arrived before any major scandal could develop. Nevertheless, I read each of these memos with a peculiar attention, not out of guilt, but out of vigilance. It was like monitoring the weak points in the structure of a gigantic building, microscopic cracks that could expand if not contained. For each such case, I would reinforce internal psychological support and expand wellness programs, but always in a cold and calculated way, as if I were oiling the machines so that they would continue to operate without creaking. During a global conference in Tokyo, I was invited to participate in a panel on transformational leadership in the 21st century. The auditorium was packed with young entrepreneurs, mid-level managers, and journalists hungry for inspiring quotes that would fit into headlines. When they handed me the microphone, I spoke slowly, without embellishments. I explained that leadership in the real world was more akin to risk engineering than romantic narratives. That those who wanted to leave a legacy would inevitably have to choose who would survive and who would fall by the wayside. There was an uncomfortable silence, and some faces were clearly shocked. A mediator tried to ease the situation, saying that my words were a harsh but necessary warning. I didn't bother to correct me. I knew they understood, even if they pretended otherwise. When I got back to my hotel that night, I lay fully clothed on my bed, staring at the ceiling with an exhaustion that wasn't just physical. The jet lag was torturing me, but more than that, it was the accumulated weight of years of making decisions that shaped not just the company but the lives of thousands of people who would never know me. I could fire 200 people with a digital signature, authorize cuts that would take jobs away from entire communities to relocate factories to more competitive countries, block mergers that would alter entire ecosystems of suppliers. This didn't bother me out of guilt. I had long since stopped harboring moral illusions about the marketplace, but it ate at me simply because I understood exactly the power of what I was doing. I was no longer an idealist, nor an avenger driven by old grievances. I was, in a way, Just the end product of the same system that had once despised me. I had become what I had once hated. The next morning, I received an encrypted call from one of my most senior directors. His tone of voice was tense, almost tremulous, something I had never heard before. He said that a group of small shareholders, unhappy with some of the recent decisions that cut dividends in favor of aggressive reinvestment, were starting to meet behind the scenes, considering maneuvers to try to change the composition of the board and reduce my decision-making power. It wasn't official yet, but he knew how I liked to anticipate moves. I thanked him for the information, calmly hung up, and then called lawyers and governance experts to an emergency meeting. I spent the next 48 hours rewriting the bylaws, strengthening anti-takeover clauses, and activating the discrete networks of institutional support that I had cultivated over the years. People who owed favors or feared losing future contracts. When the small shareholders finally articulated a formal request to reevaluate my chairmanship, they found locked doors and votes already guaranteed against any initiative of theirs. The coup was over before it was even born. This episode served to rekindle my constant alertness. As solid as the empire was, the fear that someone might subvert what I had built was a constant fire, burning low but incessant. I began to circulate even more between departments, showing up unexpectedly at regional headquarters, personally reviewing presentations that I would have previously entrusted to senior executives. To some, it was a sign of micromanagement, almost paranoia. To me, it was simply the only way to keep a firm grip on something so large that it could swallow even its creator if I let the reins go slack. Not long after, an old contact in the financial media managed to schedule an extensive interview with me, promising a cover profile on the woman who reinvented modern corporate capitalism. I accepted on the condition that there would be no questions about my personal life. The reporter, a shrewd fellow, began the meeting, all flattering, praising growth charts, management, discipline, and the courage to take on international cartels. But little by little he tried to dig deeper, asking what motivated me to work tirelessly, with no apparent desire to start a family, no visible friends. I played along for a few minutes, answering with clever-sounding but empty phrases, until he tried to close by asking, "In the end, when all this is done, what will be left for you?" I stared at him in silence for so long that the man began to feel uncomfortable, cleared his throat, fiddled with the recorder. Finally, I simply said, "A legacy that no one will dare question." He wrote it down, but I could tell from the look on his face that he hadn't found the human scoop he was looking for. We ended with a cold handshake. The article came out weeks later, full of veiled admiration and implicit criticism of my coldness. It worked exactly as I wanted. In the years that followed, as the empire was fully consolidated and several structural gaps that could have threatened it were closed, I began to have a little more time to observe the world with almost clinical detachment. I saw rival companies destroyed by ethical scandals, by reckless investments in unviable technologies, or simply by the weight of the founders' own vanity. I saw governments change tax policies abruptly, bringing down entire sectors. With each global move, I found ways to further shield the company, diversify revenues, create hidden reserves that would keep us afloat even in prolonged storms. I did this not out of compassion for employees, nor out of a sense of social duty. I did it because my entire identity was now embedded in that corporate colossus. Its death would be my symbolic death, and that was unacceptable. On a particularly quiet night, I sat in the office I kept on the top floor of the Midtown Manhattan Tower. The lights of the skyline looked like an inverted C, shining upward, and I, up there, could almost forget that somewhere down there, ordinary people were living routines that didn't include EBITDA charts or compliance protocols. I grabbed a glass of wina, rare habit that I only indulged in during moments of controlled introspection, and walked to the window. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel joy or pride. What I felt was a strange, cold peace. The clear-eyed recognition that I had won the only game that mattered to me, even if it meant giving up everything that made other lives normal. When, sometime later, rumors began to circulate that I might be invited to join government boards or even head international secretariats focused on trade, I declined before the invitation was formally received. I did not want to be at the mercy of political agendas. My power was silent, invisible in the spotlight, but absolute for those who truly understood how the global chessboard worked. So I continued to reign in the shadows, discreetly expanding the empire, eliminating risks before they became threats, nurturing the machine I had built on past humiliations and on the persistent fear that now made the world turn in my favor. As the empire reached its most refined form, I noticed something that, in other times, might have intrigued or worried me. The fear that had previously been concentrated in averted glances and awkward silences began to manifest itself in an almost reverential way. It was as if my figure had gone beyond the mere role of president and majority shareholder to become a living legend within the organization. People whispered my name in the hallways. Newly hired employees seemed to practice ways of addressing me without making any blunders. In some operational units, I noticed that photos of me at events or institutional portraits were kept as a kind of silent amulet, which caused me a mixture of strangeness and acceptance. This was the inevitable result of years of consolidating such absolute power that it had begun to merge with the very identity of the company. It wasn't long before outside consultants suggested that I start planning my succession. They argued that large conglomerates only survive in the long term, when their founders or central leaders build clear mechanisms for continuity. They argued that my omnipresent presence, while it was what gave the market the security to invest heavily, could also become a risk if, for whatever reason, I were suddenly removed from the board. I smiled patiently at each of these recommendations and then shelved them. For me, there was no succession on the horizon. What I had built was not just a corporate structure, but a direct extension of my own instinct, my rigor, my strategic drive. I saw no one, not even among the most loyal directors, capable of bearing the full weight of that legacy without distorting or corrupting it. It was a risk I was willing to take. If one day I left the stage, the fate of the empire would be decided by the raw laws of the market, without sentimentality, without symbolic inheritances. Meanwhile, I began to execute a series of quiet acquisitions in adjacent sectors that would provide additional immunity against adverse economic cycles. I invested heavily in energy assets, logistics networks, supply chain tracking technology, and quietly acquired stakes in media groups that could control the institutional narrative when necessary. All of this was done with surgical subtlety, so that even seasoned analysts could not immediately connect all the dots. My name rarely appeared, hidden among holding companies, trusts, and technical boards made up of lawyers and experts who knew exactly how to avoid the spotlight. In this way, I consolidated not just a financial empire, but an entire ecosystem that revolved around the same premises that had shaped me since that first humiliation in the boardroom years ago: absolute control, minimal exposure, and zero room for sentimentality. There were days when I would find myself walking alone through the quiet hallways of the upper floors of our Manhattan headquarters after work. The lights dimmed to discrete dots that seemed to follow my steps, casting long shadows on the impeccable carpets. I liked to hear the sound of my own heels echoing. It was a tactile reminder that I completely dominated this space, not just because of the contracts and bylaws, but because of the aura that my history had created. It was almost ritualistic. In every detail, the sober furniture, the monitoring screens with global indices, the strategically equipped crisis rooms, I saw reflected the specter of the woman I had become. A woman who did not exist to have a rich social life, did not exist for marriage or children, did not even exist to prove anything to anyone. She existed solely to exert dominance. Occasionally, I still received scattered messages from the past. An old Harvard colleague would write to me about his wedding, about his young children learning to walk, and invite me to some charity event. I would read these emails with the curiosity of someone observing a parallel reality, and then file them away without responding. Not because I despised what they had, but because there was simply no place for it within the cold architecture I had built for myself. The rare attempts at reaching out were invariably frustrated by my indifference, and gradually everyone gave up. All that remained were the formal invitations, sent by executive secretaries who knew in advance that they would be declined. As the years went by, I also began to notice how the new generation of corporate leaders watched me. Young executives who arrived at our trainee programs, ambitious and hungry, mentioned my name as if it were a code for excellence, but also for fear. Some tried to imitate my rigor, my strategies, my calculated coolness, but looking at them, I could see the limit. They had not experienced the necessary degree of initial contempt to forge that uncracked armor. They had studied at perfect schools, attended understanding mentors, built careers in companies that celebrated positive feedback more than concrete results. It wasn't that they were incompetent, many were brilliant, but they lacked what had made me invulnerable, the original scar. The eternal memory of the exact moment when I was disdained, not for my lack of talent, but for the simple certainty of others that I should not dare exist in a position of power. In a private board meeting, held in one of our most secure rooms, I watched projections that showed the conglomerate surpassing historical benchmarks. Rising charts, almost insignificant risk reports, profits distributed with precision. As some directors exchanged discreet smiles, I felt the paradoxical weight of it all. There was no longer a concrete enemy to crush. There was no internal conspiracy that posed a real threat. There was no market that could bring us down without first destroying itself. For the first time in a long time, I was overcome by a pang of boredom so profound that I almost wished that some competitor would emerge bold enough to attempt a hostile maneuver, just so I could have the pleasure of crushing it preemptively. Around the same time, discreet speculation about my health began to circulate. Some financial analysts noticed my absence from international conferences that had previously been a regular fixture on the agenda. Theories circulated that I was ill, preparing some unexpected transition. I smiled when I received these analyses through my internal channels. Because they served a curious function, they distracted the market with unfounded rumors while I quietly consolidated even more radical internal adjustments. In fact, my physical health remained stable. The only thing that had changed was my interest in certain public rituals. I no longer saw the point in flying to Davos or sitting in billionaire forums debating conscious capitalism, when I knew from concrete experience that the real machinery was not driven by speeches or temporary fads, but by the invisible and often merciless hand of those who made decisions without asking the rest of the world for permission. So I continued my relentless routine. I would leave work early, make hours-long calls in different time zones, review tiny lines of contracts that only obsessed lawyers would have the patience to analyze. At night, I would leave the building late, passing cleaning crews who would look down at me as I passed. This silent, almost superstitious respect had replaced any traditional human affection in my life. I didn't regret it. Every choice I had made along the way had eliminated different possibilities for existence. And deep down, I had always known the price. In rare moments of respite, I would sit at the large office window, watching the city pulse below, and imagine how different it all might have been if Mr. Barlow, on that distant day, had simply said welcome instead of rolling his eyes. If he had recognized my worth without having to be crushed to do so, maybe my destiny would have curved in a different direction. Maybe he would have built something less cold, less brutal. But then came the cruel thought that sustained me. If he had not humiliated me, I would never have discovered how deep I could go to ensure that no one else would dare repeat that gesture. It was the constant memory of that first affront that continued, even years later, to fuel the empire I had built on fear. As time went by, I realized that the architecture of power I had built had become so self-sustaining that it sometimes operated without my needing to intervene. The board of directors, the councils, and the entire complex web of internal managers had already absorbed my standards to the point where they anticipated problems and reacted almost automatically. It was a cold but undeniable victory. The conglomerate had achieved a level of efficiency rarely seen, shielded against blackmail, scandals, and vulnerabilities that frequently brought down other corporations. While the world outside was shaken by cycles of political crises, trade wars, health pandemics, and exchange rate volatility, our internal machinery kept running like a Swiss watch, immune to collective panic, incapable of being knocked down by breaking news. In meetings with economists hired to work on future scenarios, I saw projections that confirmed what, deep down, I already knew intuitively. We had reached a point where, barring absolute planetary catastrophes, our conglomerate would not only be a survivor, but a natural predator in any global economic rearrangement. We owned logistics chains, controlled part of the energy matrix of several regions, and had a subtle but decisive influence on media outlets that shaped narratives and calmed investors. In short, we had become indispensable to the very functioning of the system that I had once had to bend with effort. Now, the system was bending spontaneously to ensure that we remained on top, because our ruin would cause such far-reaching side effects that no one would dare to provoke them. It was at this stage that I began to observe my own trajectory with an almost scientific eye. There were no longer any external adversaries capable of challenging me head-on. The battles that did arise were insignificant small attempts by local unions to bargain for adjustments, suppliers trying to renegotiate margins, activist groups publishing outraged reports that died in footnote headlines. All of this was handled mechanically by layers and layers of managers, lawyers, and consultants who faithfully followed protocols that, in essence, had been designed by me over decades. I no longer needed to give direct orders to crush resistance. The organism itself had learned to defend itself. With that, my role slowly began to shift from tactical operator to strategic observer. I began to spend long hours in my office studying global macro indicators, buying exclusive geopolitical reports, talking to former diplomats, analyzing industry mergers that didn't even involve our direct areas, just to map trends. My pleasure was there, in foreseeing movements that no one else noticed, in pulling small, almost invisible threads that could change the future of entire sectors. I was no longer looking for immediate profits or new quarterly records. I was looking for the abstract certainty of always staying 2 or 3 steps ahead, preventing any possibility of being caught off guard like I was that first morning, when the indifference and mockery of men puffed up with themselves almost crushed me inside. During this period of mental transition, I also began to have strange dreams.